Well, good afternoon and welcome to Christian Concern Live. It's great to have you with us, whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube. We're going to have a very interesting discussion today. You can add your comments and questions in particular, either on YouTube or on Facebook, and we'll try and respond to as many of those as we can. We've got some interesting topics for you today. We're going to talk about churches in lockdown, and we're going to talk about marriage and divorce in lockdown and what's happened this week, and also an interesting judicial ruling that happened this week as well. So with me this afternoon, I've got Andrea Williams, Chief Executive of Christian Concern. There she
Hello
is.
there, everyone. Good
Nice
to
to
be
see
with
you. And Roger Kiska, one of our top lawyers at the Christian Legal Centre, is with us as well. And special guest for this week, Peter Sanlon, Rector of Emmanuel Anglican Church over in Tunbridge Wells. Peter, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we wanted to start by talking about the churches in lockdown and what's happening around that. And it's very interesting, Peter, to get your perspective in particular as a church leader on what the government is doing in terms of a blanket lockdown on all church activities. I think they're going to ease it for just private prayer on Monday. And meanwhile, all shops are opening. So, Peter, what's your perspective on that as a church leader?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that as a church minister, I am very concerned and very sad for the suffering and the illness and the death that has happened as a result of this terrible virus. I am acutely aware of it as the minister of a small church of about 50 adults. We've had 3 families have had deaths in those families.
Wow.
Directly as a result of the virus. And this afternoon, after this conversation, I'll be off to take my second socially distanced funeral. So I'm acutely aware that this virus is real, it's serious, and it causes terrible suffering and pain. So I have questions and concerns about how the government have handled this crisis, but those concerns in no way go to suggest that I don't think we should be being careful and being wise and prudent. We should take this virus very seriously. But I think the fundamental criticism I have of the government's handling of the lockdown is that they have failed in any meaningful or obvious way to guard and protect religious freedoms. So we should be very concerned about things like the freedom of speech and the freedom of thought. And even before this virus came onto our radar, we were rightly worried about it. We were seeing preachers arrested on the streets of our country. We were seeing social care workers losing their jobs because of expressing their thoughts on social media, expressing beliefs which are just basic Christian religious beliefs.
Yeah.
So we're right to be concerned about those things. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that freedom of speech and freedom of thought are actually built upon the foundation of freedom of religion.
Right.
It is freedom of religion, which that is where you test and you explore the true nature and extent of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And freedom of religion requires not just the freedom of people to hold their personal religious beliefs privately and secretly. Freedom of religion requires the freedom to gather together to worship according to your beliefs.
Yeah.
It requires freedom from government interference in your meetings. And the government basically just trampled forward in size 11 boots in a fairly catatonic state over the religious freedoms in our country in the last month or two. And I'm pretty worried about what the possible consequences could be in the coming years.
Right. And so what's your view on terms of, should churches be allowed to open? Would you like to open your church in some form or other at this point? Or, bearing in mind what you said about the effects of the virus and so on?
I think that if you'd asked me that question before lockdown was begun, then I would have suggested that there should be a very clear circumscribed piece of guidance from the government towards churches about maybe taking a break from gatherings for 2 to 3 weeks, about some suggestions about how to conduct any gatherings in a safe way.
Yeah.
And then there should be, and now that should be in a very clearly circumscribed piece of guidance rather than legislation. And then there should have been a real move to prioritize getting back to normal. In the situation we are in now,
Yes.
People have been terrified and have been sort of pushed into a corner where we're now kind of having to work back from considerable misunderstandings. You know, there's a lot of debate now about the significance of singing, about the nature of how many air molecules spread in a massive church building, you know, all kinds of debates and problems now that we wouldn't have had if the government had been duly cautious and respectful about trampling into the area of religious freedoms as thoughtlessly as it did. So in the situation we're in now, which I think we never should have been in,
right?
In the situation we're in now, I think that probably the best thing that could be done is the government should be expressing a serious commitment and a very meaningful priority of allowing and helping churches to have some kind of gathered worship meetings again as soon as possible. You know, timelines, guidance, practical advice, that's all welcome. But you know, as we sit currently, what's been issued is legislation which puts churches on a level with you know,
cinemas,
cafes, cinemas, theaters, and that is a real insult to the many people in our country who have religious beliefs, a real trampling on the natures of religious freedoms. And I think they need to work really hard, really fast to reverse gear that.
Yeah, it strikes me as well that churches are allowed to run food banks, for example, and trusted to run food banks. But even on Monday, like, you'll be allowed to gather. Well, you won't be allowed to gather. You know, one person can pray on their own in church. If two people pray, that's an informal prayer meeting. That's illegal. You know, and so it's crazy. It's like almost like they're deliberately, it feels like, trampling on spirituality and spiritual needs and spiritual life, whilst allowing churches to run food banks and things like that, as if that's totally fine. I mean, this is the extraordinary deprioritization of spiritual things, isn't it, Peter?
Yeah, and it's quite bizarre and disappointing, really, that it's the Conservative Party that is presiding over that, because for those who are interested in looking into the history of the Conservative Party in England and some of the ideas that the Conservative Party took a hold of 15 or so years ago, you look into things like compassionate conservatism, you look at the big community ideas, and there were very helpful conversations then about the way Christians and churches do social good in society, and they do it motivated and energized by their spiritual faith and their prayer life and their relationship with God. And it is deeply counterproductive to try to segment those off and separate them off. But the way this current crisis is being handled, the inconsistencies in approach show that we have people at the heart of government taking decisions who simply do not understand the nature of religious freedoms and religious beliefs, and therefore cannot really be trusted to protect freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and other freedoms that actually we look around us today, we see them under great strain and duress. Yeah.
So, and as Michael Petek's mentioning on Facebook there, we have coordinated a letter before action to the government that was sent last week or the week before, that you can pick up on the website. I'm sure one of my colleagues will post the link up there that makes this point about religious freedom. But the other point is the sort of church autonomy point, isn't it? That the state is dictating to the church here in a way that really hasn't been seen pretty much ever before, right? We've had many crises before. We had Spanish flu, we had World War II, and so on. And churches were allowed to get on with it and do what they wanted. And here the church is being dictated to by the state in a blanket fashion. You cannot do spiritual stuff. You can only do non-spiritual stuff. And that's the sort of thing that I think really is a significant change, isn't it, Peter?
Yes. And, you know, I should just underline, I don't think either you or I are saying that there should just be a complete ignoring by churches of the presence of a serious virus in our country.
Yes.
It's the way it's been gone about, the use of legislation, the infringement of churches' freedoms to govern themselves and order themselves. Yes. Given that we know there are many people in our culture who would want to erode the freedom of speech and the freedom of proclamation of religious belief in our country,
Yes.
it is a
Yes.
very dangerous step to take, to have used the machinery of government and legislation to close down public worship in that way. And if we look back into the history of our country, there are and other countries in Europe, there are so many better lessons that could have been learned from history. For example, you think of the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, 1665. Plague came to that village, and it killed just under 80% of the people in the village. And there's a memorial in the church to the people that died.
Wow.
Now, the people of that village acted very effectively to prevent the spread of the virus outside their village. They basically went into lockdown. But strikingly, the church minister continued to lead worship services, not in the church building, but in the open air.
Right.
And it was seen by people at that time that we should protect people and care for them. And if necessary, we sacrifice ourselves to protect surrounding villages. But we also make changes to the way we meet and worship in order to continue to pray to the God who is sovereign over all of these things and who loves and cares for us and is our only comfort when we are in life and in death in the midst of life. So why on earth, having just had some of the hottest, most glorious weather that our country has had for years, why on earth didn't somebody think of learning that lesson and suggesting to churches, if you meet in a confined space, why don't you explore having a socially distanced outside service in a way that is managed and controlled? That could easily have been done.
I agree. Andrea, I'd like to. Why don't you come on as well? What's your perspective on all of this in terms of church and state and lockdown?
Well, I think that as Peter's been saying, the issues are the virus has to be taken seriously. But we live in a world whereby the church recognizes and that the state has recognized the stuff that they want us to do, such as the provision of food banks, and trust us to do that, but do not trust us to open up our churches so that we might serve in a whole multitude of ways that we do day in, day out. The church has been incredibly innovative and found new ways of doing worship and services through Zoom, the Zoom platforms, through social media platforms, and that's exciting. And we know that many people are tuning in, and some of them hearing the gospel for the first time. It's been an opportunity. We rejoice in that. But also, not everyone can get in front of social media, in front of computers. There's lots of people out there with real needs who are incredibly lonely, that the church needs to be open for and needs to be physically open for. We also have things like marriages. We've been told we can't do marriages of any kind. Our supermarkets are open. We can see the beginning.
I think what's particularly frustrating, isn't it, Andrea, is that they're talking about planning to restrict or lift the restrictions on Sunday trading, right? So they want to allow even more businesses to open and bigger businesses to open on Sundays, while still stopping churches from doing worship or any kind of prayer ministry or anything like that at the same time. Churches can only do food banks or social action, must not do any spiritual action. I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it?
I think that if we can trust a supermarket to open up, and all kinds of supermarkets, so the huge, from the huge let's say a huge Sainsbury's to the local Sainsbury's to the local newsagent, if we can trust these, if the government trusts these organisations to open up in their manifest
and the church to run food banks,
then why can the church not be open to do the eternal business? People, we know that people are crying out for help, for fellowship, for need for answers in this time, and the church historically has been there. If bombs were coming down in the Second World War and the church did not close, and the government didn't force the church to close, then how is it that in response to this virus we have been forced to close?
Well, we've put out a video, haven't we, Andrea, of a number of churches talking about this, and my favourite bit, I think, is David Hathaway who remembers the Blitz. I mean, he's old enough. I think he's 90 years old, and says, you know, the church he was meeting in got bombed, and then he moved to another church and that got bombed too, right? And it's more dangerous to meet in a church then than it is now, you know. And the churches didn't close, and the churches carried on, you know, because they're allowed to, and yet now they're not allowed to. You know, that's the kind of thing, isn't it?
I think one of the things that really is a very big in principle issue. When a government starts telling you how you can pray, when you can pray, when you can open your doors, how you do your ministry. So you can do a food bank, but you can't pray with the people that are coming into your food bank. If the church begins to prescribe these things, if the state begins to do this, then that does not it sets a very uncomfortable precedent, particularly given our backdrop at Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre, where we already know that ministers, Christians in public life, Christians actually going in and trying to take school assemblies, have been prohibited from doing so because of their kind of gospel, which is essentially the true gospel.
Yeah. Now we've got a comment here from John Winlow, which I think Peter might like to respond to. On Facebook, he's saying, surely though, the reason for the government's attitude is because they do not see the main denominations as being relevant anymore. And perhaps there are other groups who are opposed anyway. I think he means opposed to lockdown restrictions at that point there. Peter, would like to comment on that?
Yes. So if I understand that correctly, you're making the point that many people in charge of taking decisions just simply view the Christian churches as an irrelevance. And I think sadly that is true. And here we plug into the issue of how exactly was the Christian church in England doing before this lockdown began. And in my opinion, things have not been at a lower spiritual ebb than prior to the great evangelical revival of the 1800s. So, you know, in a sense, I think we would be being a bit unfair to secular leaders in our government, if we just criticized them and we didn't actually look at the Christian church in our land and say that actually we have created this situation ourselves because we've simply not been what we should be. We have not, over the last decade or two, proclaimed the gospel in a fearless, spiritually powerful, compassionate way. We have perhaps locked ourselves away in our little cliques and groups, got ahead with our little hobby projects rather than preaching the gospel to the nation. You know, if we had been doing it more effectively, we wouldn't need an organization like Christian Concern, of course. So if we are irrelevant, it is our own fault. And this virus should cause us to look very hard at ourselves to say, are we really being what God has called us to do? Are we really leaning into the spiritual powers and realities that he gives us in Christ and by his Spirit?
I mean, I think if we think about what is it that people in public life and responsible for government, what is it that they understand the gospel to be? I think you're right, Peter. Have we, as the Christian church in this nation, discipled our institutions? Have we really cared for them? Have we really prayed for them? Have we really warned them when they make laws that go against God's principles and God's honor? We know, as men and women that love the Lord Jesus Christ, is that when we dishonor him, individually, but also corporately, then chaos ensues. And there's a sense in which this abounding chaos that we are currently in with regard to our response to COVID, now with regard to the stuff that's happening on our streets, a lot of the chaos and the inability to have one strong cultural narrative that points us towards freedom and beauty and truth. I mean, part of the government's issue around all of this stuff as well is that they are boxing Christianity into all other religions. We are viewed alongside Islam, we're viewed alongside other religious groups.
Which wouldn't have been the case in previous generations, would it, Andrea? That's the point.
Well, no, and I think that this is it. I mean, I'm not at all embarrassed to say What is it that will give life to a nation? The gospel gives life to a nation. And when we see, of course, it's nothing this side of eternity, this side of heaven is perfect. But where a country really values the truth of Christianity at the heart of our institutions and laws, then we see historically a great flourishing.
Yeah. I've got a comment here from Harry Coverdale on Facebook, which I think Roger might like to comment on. Actually, he says, "I personally have been preaching the open air gathering with other believers to remember the Lord on the Lord's Day, obviously distancing from one another. I cannot see a problem with that, or am I being rebellious?" Roger, what's your take on that one? Open air preaching.
Yeah, I think if you're allowed to do open air exercising, why not open air preaching? And what's important to realize here is that the law isn't meant to be paternalistic. Any restriction on our rights has to be constitutionally justifiable, and freedom of religion still has a standard of strict scrutiny, meaning that to interfere with it, there has to be a high level of justification, and you have to use the most narrowly tailored means to pursue that legitimate aim. So I think Andrea was absolutely correct. What is the difference, rationally speaking, between people responsibly socially distancing in a church for 1 hour and dozens, if not hundreds, of people going through a Sainsbury's during the course of a day? There's no rational basis for these restrictions. It is really just we're the government, we say so, and that is not a constitutionally justifiable way to look at it.
Yeah. So I want to move on to the next topic now, which is marriage and divorce. And of course, one of the things that the lockdown has done is actually prevented marriages. Actually, marriages are banned. You cannot get married, religious or otherwise, if you can't get any legal marriage done at the moment in lockdown. And Peter, as a church leader, what's your thinking, or has that had an effect on your ministry?
Well, yes, I mean, I have seen it in our church. We have one couple in our church whose daughter was due to get married, and that marriage has had to be postponed as a result of the legislation of lockdown. And that causes real hurt and upset and sadness. And I think that when you lay out on the table all of the things that have been done during lockdown, vis-a-vis marriage and relationships and so forth, you see the incredible incoherence of the government's position. You know, for a surreal few weeks in our nation, it was illegal for somebody to go and have sex with somebody who was a member of a different household. So in a surreal, bizarre way, they actually legislated against sex outside marriage, almost.
Yeah, enforced monogamy.
Somebody lose his job in the government as an advisor because of having an affair. And during that time, it was not legal to have a wedding, which would make you a household and make a sexual relationship appropriate. But it was okay to have a small socially distanced funeral. The inconsistencies here, and now we have a situation where you can go and stay over at somebody else's house, but a wedding is still illegal. You know, the incoherence and the inconsistencies here, that marriage and social life and community and religious convictions, they all hang together as a beautiful, delicate, organic whole. And once you start just issuing diktats about, you can do this, not that, this one, you know, once you've had a government committee that's got a list of bullet points and they've picked out one and then not the other one as to what you can or can't do and fit it on a spreadsheet, you've torn apart at the fragile, interrelated balance of rights and freedoms and duties and responsibilities. And it just suggests to me that the people in charge just have very little understanding of the nature of the Christian foundation of this country and the nature of the various freedoms that we should cherish.
Yeah. And at the same time, having, with marriage being, you can't get married and haven't been able to get married ever since lockdown. They've just gone through the second reading in the House of Commons, the no-fault divorce bill, which actually, tears apart the institution of marriage, right? So, it actually makes it easier to break a marriage than it is to break out of a phone contract. It's a unilateral divorce, isn't it? I mean,
easier to come out of my phone contract. What a thought! Essentially, to be able to dismantle. well, if you can dismantle marriage by basically giving notice, I give notice and be out of it within 6 months, it guts marriage of those beautiful vows that we make to stay with one another, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. Real lifelong values, the solemn nature of marriage. I think what was striking, heartbreaking on Tuesday is that in the House of Commons at second reading, 231 MPs voted for no fault divorce, giving this simple notice. Only 16 MPs voted against it. And I think we have to look and we have to salute those MPs and the courage that it took and their foresight. And history will judge them very, very well. Danny Kruger said this: what will this bill do? Its practical effect is simply that couples will not have to wait for 2 years for a no-fault divorce, but will have to wait for only 6 months. And I can appreciate that 2 years must feel like an eternity for someone who wants to move on with their life. But I suggest that the damage done to society and future generations by this bill will be far greater than the distress of some people waiting 18 months longer. Fiona Bruce said, can't we just talk about it? Can I just know why? Silence, silence, because there is no one to answer. The young woman with a baby in her arms and a toddler at her feet. But her husband said, I'm divorcing you. I'm divorcing you. And so for the wrong partners, there's no way of proper redress, of justice in this situation. The breakup of a marriage is traumatic. It's not the law that makes it traumatic. Making getting out of marriage easier won't make it any less traumatic. What we need to be doing as a society is helping people to understand the true nature of marriage, and then putting strong building blocks in place in order to promote and keep marriage.
Yeah, and it's the unilateral aspect to it as well that I find shocking, that one partner can just unilaterally decide this family is breaking up, right? With all that implies, if for any children, and we know that family breakdown is like the quickest route into poverty, and for both partners in terms of probably having to sell the house and the massive disruption, the massive change of life that it means. I mean, Roger, have you got more comments on what this no fault divorce bill means?
Yeah, I do. Again, the irony that this is being done at the same time that we're not allowed to get married, and we have to remember that the freedom to marry is guaranteed by the Human Rights Act. So not only is freedom of religion guaranteed under Article 9, but under Article 12, the right to marry is guaranteed. Now, social scientists, psychologists, anthropologists all agree that the best place for a child is to be raised in the natural family with a mom and a dad. There's no question about that. There's no question also that in the last 40 or 50 years, there has been an absolute and fundamental breakdown of the healthy marriage culture we once had in the United Kingdom. And that is causing all sorts of societal problems. It's causing crimes, dropout rates, teenage pregnancy, transition of sexually transmitted diseases. We need a healthy marriage culture. And what we don't need is no-fault divorce. We have to remember we're living in a time that prides itself on being incredibly woke and pro-woman. But no-fault divorce is anti-woman. It leaves a vulnerable woman protected when her husband wants to leave her and the family without any consequences. It's just unfathomable.
Yeah, we've got an interesting legal question here from Michael Petek on Facebook. Would it be feasible to draft a prenuptial agreement providing that the defendant in a civil divorce proceeding gets all the property of the marriage unless the cause has first been adjudicated by an ecclesiastical tribunal? What about that, Roger? What about that? Interesting idea, hey?
I mean, it's an interesting idea, certainly. And the principle of church autonomy is one of the fundamental ones at the European Court of Human Rights. The Grand Chamber has ruled on it 3 times. So I think if you had a contract that was binding, according to ecclesiastical law, then that is binding. I think that is the way to get around it, certainly. And we've seen in other jurisdictions, in parts of the United States, for example, where they have covenant marriage, right, which gets around the no-fault divorce rules. So there are ways to contract a marriage to keep the healthy marriage.
I think all of this is pretty much like an endpoint, isn't it? I think what's really happened is that, from beginning to make divorce easier in 1969, then the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1973, all the cohabiting relationships, those being recognised in law, then really moving on to civil partnerships, which were in effect the precursor, which were de facto, or not in name, but de facto same-sex marriages. That's how they were called culturally. And then to same-sex marriage. What you then get is marriage not being marriage not being understood in society as marriage, when people were already being able to get out and break it, when in fact, I would say again, we have to look at the Christian church in our nation and say, where were we on this? What did our marriages look like? What did our families look like? Were we flowing with the culture? Did we speak clearly on sexual purity, on the importance of sexual purity of heart, as we raise our children to be pure of heart and to be pure as they enter marriage, to understand how solemn that commitment was? All of that is the backdrop against which marriage has become literally something that you can tear up, a piece of paper that can be torn up, or it can be torn up via the internet. I divorce you. I'm going to divorce you. No reasons needed. I'm getting out of this contract. It's if marriage begins to mean in practice nothing, the law will follow, and that's what's happened. We've not, but of course we know, and the reason why so many Christian couples are struggling at this time is because still, counter to the culture, they say we can't cohabit. We are. The sexual bond will be our expression of commitment. And we do that after our public vow. For them, marriage matters.
Yes.
But their view of what marriage is isn't set by the state any longer, because the state no longer reflects the Christian view of marriage. And this is the mess that we've got ourselves into. And it was what Peter's point earlier, really, is that if you make a whole load of laws as they flow, then they become incoherent. And that's why we go back, as we often do at Christian Concern, almost to a signature verse of Christian Concern, which is in Colossians 1, where it talks about the supremacy of the Son of God. The Son is the image of God, of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority. All things have been created through him and for him. And in Jesus, all things hold together. So it's this point. All laws hold together in Jesus Christ. All laws hold together in God's creation purposes. And that's why this nation has had a coherent legal system, has had a coherent societal system. And when we shift our culture to a whole rights-based culture where there is no idea of what is right or wrong, in fact, because every man does what is right in their own sight, then we end up with this chaos and inability to have a common mind, a gospel mind about what the answers are when we're faced with brutality, when we're faced with struggle on the streets, when we're faced with with COVID-19. I mean, it was interesting because
Andrea, I want to move on. I want to move on really to another subject. We are, by the way, going to have a live stream seminar on July the 6th on marriage. So do join us on that, talking about what the meaning of marriage is, and should the government promote marriage, is the question for that. And thank you, Peter, for your contributions on those topics. Very valuable, very insightful to hear from.
With us, Peter. Really good.
Thank you.
On the ground.
I just want to underline, I think, as I say goodbye, that I think that the effect of this virus on all of the issues that matter to Christian Concern that you've been campaigning on for many years, what has happened is that this virus has just accelerated the problems. So in the same way as the high street was dying in England and Amazon was taking over, the virus has accelerated it by 10 years. You know, we were already struggling with issues of freedom of religion, freedom of thought, issues of the definition of marriage and so forth, the end of life issues. And this virus just seems to have just catapulted us forward. Like we were dealing with a set of cut flower culture, The beautiful flowers that had their watering from the gospel and our Christian heritage, they were dry and dead. And this virus is like a wind that's just blowing through and the leaves just blowing off. So there's continuity there. Yeah.
Peter, thank you for your faithful ministry. We appreciate you.
God bless. Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Yeah. So, but Peter mentioned there the point about end of life and euthanasia. And there's been a very disturbing legal case this week of a chap whose legal name or pseudonym is MSP. And he had said that he didn't want to live with a stoma, and then changed his mind and agreed to an operation. But the judge ruled that he should die anyway. Roger, do you want to start by talking us through what really happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. This is perhaps one of the most disturbing cases that has come across to the UK in recent memory. We're on the heels of high-profile end-of-life cases like Charlie Gard, Alfie Evans, baby Isaiah. But this one just shocks the conscious. You have a 34-year-old man who the Court of Protection describes as being somewhat vain. He enjoyed dating. He had apparently an active sex life, which he was very proud of. And the judge defines his life based on pleasure. On the other hand, you have a young gentleman who had a history of self-harming. He was bipolar, so he was by definition vulnerable. And because of ongoing bowel issues, he needed a stoma bag put in, which caused him embarrassment. It limited his ability to live the life he wanted to live it. And he had no problem sharing his displeasure with close friends about his condition and signing an advance directive about not wanting heroic measures taken or a stoma bag put back in after he took it out. So he has it taken out. A few days later, medical issues ensue, and he's admitted to Barnsley Hospital, faced with life and death now. I have to remember, this is a vulnerable guy. We don't know if he's had any therapy to come to grips with this condition, but faced with life and death, the biggest existential crisis of his life. He fully capacitous at the time, gives his informed consent to have a procedure done to save his life, to put in the stoma bag again. When he is unconscious as a result of that, the hospital takes the matter to the Court of Protection, and Justice Hayden, who was the same judge in the Alfie Evans case, decides that despite the clearly expressed wishes of MSP, he really thought that MSP wanted to die. And as a result, he ordered that MSP remain sedated while hydration and nutrition was removed. He did so.
He was sedated for the operation, is that right? He was sedated
from the operation, but they continued to sedate him because he was coming out of it. Apparently, he was, paragraph 19 of the judgment talks about him reaching for the tube that was keeping him breathing and trying to pull it out. So they kept him sedated. So this wasn't about sepsis. This was about actively sedating him. And what I want to mention about this is this court actually calls upon us to believe in Bentham utilitarianism, that the only purpose of life is pleasure. And when you can't have the pleasure you want, there's no worth in living. And that should terrify us all. This was nothing short of euthanasia. A guy who gives his express consent to wanting to live, and a judge saying, no, while you're sedated, we're going to end your life.
And he has now died, hasn't he?
He has passed.
Actually felt heartbroken. Because we follow these cases and we read the judgment, we analysed in the legal centre the judgment, and saw that what was being said, saw that what was actually being said in the judgment was not how the case was being reported. The case was being reported in a way that made you think that he'd really chosen this and they were just carrying out his wishes. It's clear that he changed his mind. But in this case, the judge says that he did. And he also says that the previous advance directive was not properly legal. So you have a situation whereby this change of heart occurs and he begins to come round. We don't actually know even what he thought. The point was he didn't get the chance to speak, the chance to live when he'd chosen the operation in order to live. So it's absolutely tragic. We were asking for a review of this decision. Of course, we didn't have any position in the case. We didn't know this young man. We knew nothing from that. We just had the case in front of us. But we said that this ought to be reviewed, and we wrote to the official solicitor and to the Lord Chancellor and to the court, to Barnsley Hospital, to ask that this might be reviewed. But the day after we wrote, sadly, we got news that MSP had died. I think it's really concerning. The secrecy of these courts, the ability to properly scrutinise these courts is very difficult. And we need to understand what is coming in. And like, again, and just going back, I suppose, to the cases of Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard and Isaiah, those cases were cases where the parents had another way of giving care to the children and were told you cannot access that care. I think that was also tragic, not to give the parents the chance, no matter how slim, of giving treatment to their children. But on this one, you had a man who changed his mind, and the judge said what he said earlier, that he didn't really want to live with a stoma bag, and overruled that change of mind. Very, very, very sinister, very disturbing.
Yeah. So, and how much authority do the judges have here? I mean, can the judges do they just have power over life and death? I'm really looking to you, Roger, here. You know, is it totally within his jurisdiction to say you can live or you cannot live, based on his judgment of quality of life and whether you think you'd enjoy your life? I mean, it seems extraordinary. Do they really have this power, the judges? Is that within the law, what he's done?
Well, they shouldn't. We live in a parliamentary democracy, not a judiciocracy, where the judges make the law. Every single case that was cited in that opinion dealt with patients who did not have the ability to give their informed consent to a procedure. They were unconscious and they had no chance of surviving otherwise. Here you have the express consent given, and one of the I think it was the third to last paragraph says he was fully capacitous when he gave his informed consent. So this is a simple case of a judge saying, I don't care what you consented to. I don't care what your state of mind is. I'm going to hold you to what you said earlier. And there's no precedent for it. And I hope there will be no precedent in the future going forward. This needs to be reviewed.
So it's the first case of its kind ever to have happened like this in the UK?
Where the person was fully capacitous and gave his informed consent, absolutely.
Right.
I think that we need people need to read that judgment for themselves. To see, and I think that one of the skills of Mr. Justice Hayden is the way in which he writes these judgments. It was, and there were a number of them also in the case of Alfie Evans, where we were involved in the later stages. The way the twists, the language, the use of language, the way in which the way in which he describes what he thinks the wishes might be, and the way in which he tries to draw other people alongside him in that. It feels like he's not just addressing the issue at hand, but making a case to a wider audience.
Yeah. Well, do read that. We've got an article on our website, and the judgment is also up or linked to on our website as well, and a press release as well on it. We're keen for people to know.
Comment piece by Pavel Stroilov, who's a lawyer with the consultant lawyer with the Christian Legal Centre, and I think it would be great for people that are interested in that to take a look at that article. I know that Roger has also produced a short film on this, and I do think alongside reading the judgment, it would be great to listen to Roger on that and to read Pavel's opinion piece, because they're strong opinion pieces, and I stand by everything that Roger and Pavel are saying, and we need to, in the melee and speed of all the things that are happening, we need to continue to seek justice for MSP, actually, and seek to ensure that this sort of thing does not happen again. The light has to be shone into the Court of Protection. The Court of Protection is named as such because the decisions that are made there are over people that need to be protected by the system, by the state. But if the system or the state is not thinking straight, then that needs to be exposed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're out of time right now. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. I certainly did. Great to have Peter Sanlon on. Thank you to Roger and Andrea as well. We've got a Gospel Issues seminar being live streamed this Monday, the 15th of June, with Joe Boot about confronting secular culture by recovering the Christian mind. Joe Boot is a fantastic Bible teacher. I do hope you're able to join us for that. That's 8 p.m. on Monday, right here where you are now on YouTube and Facebook. And do follow us, subscribe, sign up to our emails, and I hope to see you again either on Monday or next Friday as well. Thank you for joining us today.